What is up, guys? My name is Fran and welcome back to the channel. So Apple recently announced and released the all-new Mac Studio powered by the M1 Max and M1 Ultra processors. And of course, in today's video, we are going to be checking it out. So the all-new Apple Mac Studio is a computer that I've been waiting for Apple to make for a really long time. I always had a couple of requirements for my primary workstation. That for it to be a desktop computer, preferably a small form factor desktop computer, powerful enough to edit my Final Cut Pro videos that I do here for the channel, as well as some personal projects, and doing both of those things while simultaneously operating silently or as close to as silent as it possibly could. Now, the last generation Apple M1 Mac Mini was as close as I ever got to that dream, but unfortunately that computer was just not quite powerful enough for all the projects that I'd want to throw at it. Often once I threw a couple of effects or transitions, it would chug in the timeline and take a really long time to export my videos. However, with the all-new Mac Studio, this thing can handle anything I throw at it. But I'm probably getting a little ahead of myself, so first let's take a quick step back and take a look at the physical attributes of the Mac Studio and also look at some of its configurations and the pricing around each configuration. So starting with the physical appearance of the Mac Studio, I won't be the first one to say this, but this thing looks like two Mac Minis stacked on top of each other and fused together, or a single Mac Mini with a high top and just completely on steroids. It's not the prettiest computer in the world, and Johnny Ives would probably be really upset right now. However, I will say this system is really functional, and by functional, I mean it's got a ton of I/O. So along the back of this unit, you are going to find 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports, a 10 gigabit Ethernet port, 2 USB A ports, presumably 3.2 Gen 2. You're going to find a single HDMI 2.0 port, which is a little bit disappointing, and a high impedance 3.5mm headphone jack. And along the front of the system, you're going to find an SD card reader, and depending on which model you get, on the M1 Max processors, you're going to get 2 USB-C ports, and then on the M1 Ultra systems, you're going to get 2 more Thunderbolt 4 ports. And that is a ton of I/O, especially for Apple desktop computers. Now, when it comes to the configuration and some of the costs behind the Mac Studio, there are a number of different ways you can put this system together. Let's quickly head on over to Apple's website and take a look. So it all pretty much starts off with our CPU. So if you choose the Apple M1 Max processor, you're going to have a limitation of either 24 GPU core CPU or a 32 GPU core CPU. You're going to be able to start off with 32 gigabytes of unified memory, but you're going to max out at around 64 gigabytes of memory. But then when it comes to our storage, it's absolutely unlocked. So you can go as low as 512 gigabyte SSDs. You can go all the way up to the 8 terabyte SSD. Now, if you go ahead and switch your processor over to the M1 Ultra, you're going to have 2 options. You're going to have that double baseline 20 CPU core, 48 GPU core processor, but then there's a bump up, which is 20 CPU cores and 64 GPU cores, which is pretty much double the configuration we saw with the M1 Max processor. But this time around, you're going to have a limitation of the minimum amount of unified memory is going to be 64 gigabytes, but this time now you can go up to 128 gigabytes of unified memory. And then finally, when it comes to our storage, you're no longer going to have that 512 gigabyte option. Not that you'd really want it anyway. Now your minimum is going to be a 1 terabyte SSD, and your maximum is once again going to be that 8 terabyte of SSD storage. But now that we've got all that out of the way, let's talk about what really matters, and that's going to be the performance that we saw out of the Mac Studio. Now, I ran a number of benchmarks, both synthetic and not, against 3 different systems. I ran it against the baseline Mac Studio with the M1 Max processor, the baseline Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra processor, and then finally, I ran the same test against my 16-inch MacBook Pro, which is powered by the M1 Max processor. All right, so for our first set of tests, I ran the quintessential synthetic benchmarks, both Geekbench and Cinebench. So first off, starting off with Geekbench, when it comes to our single core scores, we're seeing pretty similar numbers, around 1,770, give or take a couple of points across all 3 of our systems. But then when it comes to our Metal scores and our multi-core scores across the other 2 systems compared to the baseline Mac Studio, we're seeing higher numbers. And more specifically highlighting the M1 Ultra system, which is pretty much seeing double the multi-core score and almost double the Metal score, which is pretty much to be expected considering it pretty much has double the specifications of the baseline Mac Studio. And then when it comes to Cinebench, it is a pretty similar story. When it comes to our single core scores, they're pretty much the same across all 3 of the systems. But when it comes to our multi-core scores, we're seeing much higher numbers, and once again, double the numbers of the M1 Ultra versus the baseline Mac Studio. And then for my final synthetic benchmark, I ran Blender Benchmark, and here we're seeing some pretty interesting numbers. Our baseline Mac Studio and 16-inch MacBook Pro are scoring very similarly in the CPU category, with the 16-inch MacBook Pro scoring a little bit higher in the GPU category, considering it has more GPU cores. But then if we take a look at the numbers coming out of the Mac Studio powered by the M1 Ultra processor, we're seeing much higher numbers. So it seems like Blender is actually, as of right now, able to take advantage of those extra CPU and GPU cores. Now for our final set of benchmarks, I ran Puget Systems Premiere Pro Benchmark, which is not really considered a synthetic benchmark, as well as a couple of export projects with some H.265 footage that I shot on my Sony a7S Mark III. So starting off by taking a look at the Premiere Pro benchmark numbers, our baseline Mac Studio powered by the 24 GPU core M1 Max processor scored 1061, while our 16-inch MacBook Pro with the 32 GPU core system scored a whopping 1291. So that's a pretty significant difference between those two scores. But then here's a really interesting one. Our M1 Ultra system only scored 1308. Now, considering that this system pretty much has double the performance, or almost double the performance of our 16-inch MacBook Pro, we would think that the gap would be a little bit wider, but as we can see, Premiere Pro may not necessarily be optimized to be able to take advantage of all those extra CPU and GPU cores, so that's why our score isn't that far off. And for my next test, I imported that H.265 footage that I shot on my Sony a7S Mark III and created a 14-minute timeline, adding a bunch of transitions and effects and also a couple of color grades just to really make the system work. Now I'll go ahead and leave the numbers up on the screen so you guys can take a look for yourself. But as you can see, the 16-inch MacBook Pro outpaced both our base Mac Studio and our M1 Ultra Mac Studio in H.264 and H.265 exports. We saw something even more strange. We saw our 24 GPU core Mac Studio outpace our M1 Ultra and also the 16-inch MacBook Pro when it came to ProRes exports. So not really sure what's going on here. I ran these tests a number of times and it is actually an average when it comes to our numbers, but it seems like the optimization needs to happen also in DaVinci Resolve when it comes to these new systems. And then when testing in Adobe Premiere Pro with the same H.265 footage, creating a 14-minute timeline, and once again adding a bunch of transitions, color grades, etc. I'll go ahead and once again throw the numbers up here on the screen, and now we're seeing some other type of behavior. Here we're seeing consistent numbers in H.264 and H.265 export footage across all three of our systems. But then when it comes to ProRes, we're seeing a bit of a variation, with this time the M1 Ultra system outpacing the other two, but only by a very small amount. We're seeing pretty much very similar numbers. You can even call these within a margin of error when it comes to testing it out. So once again, as we can see, Premiere Pro not very optimized to take advantage of the extra resources of our new Mac Studios. And then finally, I imported the exact same footage into Apple's Final Cut Pro, once again creating a 14-minute timeline with very similar attributes. I'll go ahead and throw the numbers up here on the screen. Oh, and by the way, I did not do H.265 tests because it just took way too long when testing. But as you guys can see, when it comes to our H.264 footage, this is truly where we're seeing an optimized application take advantage of the extra resources, as we're seeing a considerably faster export time from our Mac Studio powered by the M1 Ultra processor. But then when it came to ProRes, we start to see some really interesting and weird behavior. I actually saw our fastest time come out of our 16-inch MacBook Pro, but I wasn't able to repeat that. So the numbers you're seeing on the screen are the ones I was actually able to repeat. And then I saw some really, really slow numbers come out of our baseline Mac Studio, which was around 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Again, I wasn't able to repeat that, but these are the numbers that you're seeing here that are more so of an average. But what's also interesting you'll see here is that our 16-inch MacBook Pro consistently outpaced our Mac Studio powered by the M1 Ultra. So pretty interesting numbers when it comes to ProRes, but H.264 numbers are definitely optimized. But now that you've gotten a chance to see the benchmarking numbers of the Mac Studio and I've gotten a chance to digest them, here are just some of my thoughts. So overall, I'm absolutely loving the Apple Mac Studio. It's definitely the computer that I've been waiting for a really long time. It's got a ton of I/O. As I mentioned, it's a small form factor desktop. It's really quiet. At no time during any of my testing did I ever hear the fan. You can definitely put your hand back there and feel it, but I never heard the fan kick up. It was never audible, and it pretty much just operates silently and stealthily, as I really would like a powerful desktop computer. It's a fantastic machine for prosumers and even professionals if you configure it all the way up correctly. correctly, and even at its baseline, I think it's still a really good system. I mean, I still think there's a place for the Apple Mac Mini, as if you're just someone who needs a baseline desktop computer, a desktop Macintosh computer, and you don't want to go for a laptop or anything like that. I think the Mac Mini has a really good place in the market, but as of right now, if you're somebody like me who just needs a little bit of a bump up, even the baseline Mac Studio is plenty of machine. Now for me personally, I'll definitely be keeping one of these Mac Studios. I guess the real question is which one? But I think I'll save the answer to that question for another video, as I still have a ton of testing to do on the all-new Mac Studio. But with that being said, I'll go ahead and wrap this video up. As always, if you guys like this video, hit the like button, and if it's your first time to the channel and you want to see more, consider subscribing. Once again, guys, my name is Fran. Thanks for checking out this video, and I'll see you guys in my next one.